Okay, so today we're going to dive into something that's been in the headlines a lot lately and is pretty important globally, right? We're talking about the possibility of the US and Iran sitting down again to chat about the whole nuclear situation. And what's interesting is how different folks within Iran are reacting to this.
Yeah, it is really interesting, all the different perspectives at play within Iran.
Hmm.
To unpack all this, we've got some great sources lined up. There's this recent Newsweek piece that digs into how Iranian newspapers, the conservative and the reformist ones, are covering these potential talks. Gives us a good sense of the internal debate.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, we got to revisit the JCPOA, right? The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I mean, that's the whole backdrop for everything that's going on now. So we'll be pulling from the Wikipedia page for that. Got to get that historical context.
Absolutely. Can't understand the present without understanding the past, right? Plus, we've got a few other news snippets that'll give us that extra bit of context to make sense of where things stand at this very moment.
Exactly right. It's all about connecting those dots. So let's jump right in. This Newsweek article, it points out how, different Iranian newspapers are running with these sharply contrasting headlines about these potential talks with the U.S. I mean, these talks could happen in Oman, which is interesting in itself.
Right. And it's not just like subtle differences in wording. These headlines really expose deep divisions, as the article puts it, between the conservative and reformist factions over the whole idea of even talking to the U.S. again.
So it's not just a simple Iran is for talks or Iran is against talks situation. There's way more nuance there, right? There's a real internal struggle going on, different camps with different ideas about how to deal with this whole nuclear issue.
Huge internal debate, and it's important to keep that in mind as we go forward.
For sure. Okay, so before we get too deep into the current situation, let's rewind a bit. Let's go back to the JCPOA. Can you give us a quick rundown of what exactly that agreement was all about?
Yeah, so the JCTOA, it was basically a deal to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifting some of those economic sanctions that had been placed on them. It was pretty comprehensive, laid out specific actions Iran would take and for how long.
Right. I remember that. They had to do a lot.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So they agreed to get rid of their entire stockpile of medium-enriched uranium. And that's important because that's a step closer to weapons-grade material. They also had to slash their low-enriched uranium stockpile by a huge margin, like 98%, and that was for 13 years.
Wow, 90%. That's a big chunk.
Oh, yeah, it was a major reduction. And then there were the centrifuges, the machines they used to enrich uranium.
Yeah.
They had to cut those back, too, by like two-thirds, again, for 13 years.
Okay, so big cuts to the material, big cuts to the machinery, and this was all to slow down their potential to make a weapon, right?
Exactly. The whole point was to make it much harder and take much longer for them to get enough material for a bomb if they ever decided to go down that road. And they also agreed to keep their uranium enrichment levels super low at 3.67%. And that's key because weapons-grade uranium, you need about 90%.
Okay, so big difference there.
Huge difference. They also agreed not to build any new facilities for heavy water for 15 years. And that's important because heavy water can be used in reactors that produce plutonium, which is another path to a nuclear weapon.
So it sounds like this JCPOA was pretty restrictive, trying to box in their nuclear program from multiple angles.
Yeah, it was definitely a multi-pronged approach, with the goal of making a breakout to a nuclear weapon really difficult. And to make sure Iran was sticking to the deal, there was a ton of monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA.
The IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, right?
So that's the one. In 2018 alone, their inspector spent, get this, 3,000 calendar days total in Iran, making sure everything was kosher. So pretty serious oversight there.
That sounds like pretty intense scrutiny. But as I recall, things didn't exactly go smoothly with the JCPOA, did they? There was a lot of pushback, right? Especially from the U.S.
Oh, yeah, definitely. There were big bumps along the way, no doubt about it. And a major turning point, the one that really threw a wrench in the whole thing, was when the U.S. decided to pull out of the deal.
Right, back in 2017, wasn't it?
Yeah. In October of 2017, then President Trump said the U.S. wouldn't certify the JCPOA anymore. And then in May of 2018, boom, the U.S. officially withdraws and slaps sanctions back on Iran.
And that was huge, right? I mean, that move, it really undercut the whole agreement and fueled a lot of distrust towards the U.S., I would imagine, especially from the more conservative voices in Iran.
Oh, absolutely. It validated those who are already skeptical of the U.S. and strengthened their argument that the U.S. couldn't be relied on to uphold its end of the bargain. That really sowed the seeds for a lot of the skepticism and negativity we see in those Iranian headlines today. And the reformists who were pushing for engagement, well, it kind of weakened their position, made it harder for them to argue for the benefits of diplomacy.
Yeah, I can see that. So the U.S. pulling out definitely added fuel to that internal debate in Iran and kind of poisoned the well for future talks. But even before the JCPOA, there were attempts to deal with Iran's nuclear program, right? A whole history of back and forth negotiations, tensions.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't like the JCPOA just appeared out of thin air. There was a whole lot of history there, a lot of failed attempts, a lot of mistrust that built up over time.
Can you walk us through some of that? Like, what were some of the major moments leading up to the JCPOA?
Sure. So go back as far as 2005. This is during President Ahmadinejad's time. There were Iranian negotiators who were actually accused of treason by their own government just for trying to negotiate. That gives you an idea of how charged the atmosphere was.
Wow, treason. That's intense.
Yeah, not exactly climate conducive to diplomacy, right? And before that, there was an agreement with the EU3, that's the UK, France, and Germany. But that fell apart too. And then Iran, they started ramping up their uranium enrichment again.
So a lot of stop and start, lots of suspicion on both sides.
Exactly. So fast forward a bit, and you have the formation of the P5+1. That's those 3 European countries plus China, Russia, and the U.S. all coming together to try and find a solution.
Okay, so a bigger, more international effort this time.
Right, more players at the table. And then you have this interim deal in 2013, the Joint Plan of Action. It's interesting, this deal also involved talks in Oman, just like those potential new talks we're talking about now. And some key figures back then are involved now too, guys like William Burns and Jake Sullivan on the U.S. side, and Ali Asghar Khaji for Iran.
So some familiar faces, some continuity there.
Yeah, they've been down this road before. And 2013 was also when Hassan Rouhani got elected as president in Iran, and he was all about trying to get these nuclear negotiations back on track.
And then the JCPOA itself comes out of those long, drawn-out negotiations.
Exactly. It was a long road, over 20 months of talks with extensions, deadlines, and finally a framework agreed in Lausanne in April 2015, and the whole thing signed, sealed, and delivered in Vienna in July of that year.
Okay, so back to the JCPOA for a bit. We talked about the reductions in uranium, the limits on centrifuges, but what else was in there? What were some of the other sticking points that people had with it?
Well, a big one was the technology restrictions. The JCPOA basically put a cap on the kinds of centrifuges Iran could use. They could only operate around 6,000 centrifuges total, and most of those had to be older, less efficient models. Their more advanced centrifuges, the ones that can enrich uranium much faster, those had to be put in storage and monitored by the IAEA. And they couldn't build any new enrichment facilities for 15 years.
So, like, they were essentially frozen technologically, right? Stuck with older tech to keep things slow.
Yeah, exactly. It was all about buying time, making sure they could just rapidly advance their program. But here's the thing, and this was a major point of contention, especially for folks who opposed the deal. There were these things called sunset clauses built into the JCPOA.
Sunset clauses, those were the expiration dates on some of these restrictions, right?
Yeah, basically. So after 15 years, a lot of those key restrictions, stuff like the limits on the number and type of centrifuges, the enrichment levels, those would start to expire. And this made some people really nervous because it meant that down the line, Iran could theoretically ramp up its program pretty quickly without those constraints in place.
Yeah, I remember that being a big worry for some folks. They argued that the JCPOA just kicked the can down the road, and eventually Iran would be free to go full speed ahead with its nuclear program.
Right, that was their big concern, that the JCPOA wasn't a permanent solution, just a temporary fix that didn't actually address the long-term issues. And it really highlighted this fundamental difference in perspectives about Iran's intentions. Some people believe that the JCPOA could build trust and pave the way for a more cooperative relationship in the long run. But others were deeply skeptical of Iran's motives and saw the sunset clauses as evidence that Iran was just biding its time until they can pursue a nuclear weapon without any restrictions.
It's fascinating how this one agreement really exposed these deeply held beliefs about Iran, its intentions, and the best way to deal with it.
For sure. And there was another point of contention that was mostly a U.S. internal issue, and that was the legal status of the JCPOA. In the U.S., it wasn't considered a formal treaty that needed approval from the Senate. It was more of a political commitment.
So a future president could just rip it up without too much trouble.
Exactly, which is exactly what happened. And this legal status, it made the JCPOA really vulnerable to shifts in U.S. politics.
Yeah.
And within the U.S., you had this really intense debate going on about the JCPOA. You had a lot of people supporting it, experts, diplomats, scientists, even military leaders. But you also had strong opposition from others, like retired generals, pro-Israel groups, people who were deeply suspicious of Iran and didn't believe any deal could work.
So from the get-go, it was really divisive in the U.S. And then, of course, the U.S. pulls out.
Right. And that move, it pretty much torpedoed the deal. And it really undermined the position of those within Iran who were arguing for engagement with the West. It played right into the hands of the hardliners who were saying, see, we told you, you can't trust the Americans.
Totally. It made diplomacy look bad, like a sucker's game. Okay, so the U.S. pulls out of the JCPOA. What happened next? What did Iran do?
Well, predictably, Iran wasn't too happy about the U.S. breaking its end of the deal. So starting in May 2019, they started gradually stepping back from their commitments under the JCPOA.
So basically saying, if you're not going to play by the rules, neither are we.
Pretty much. They started exceeding those limits on uranium enrichment that were set by the deal and stockpiling more enriched uranium than they were allowed. And then things got really concerning in December when there were reports that Iran had enriched uranium up to 60%.
60%? That's getting really close to weapons grade, right?
It is. It's a big jump from that 3.67% limit that was in the JCPOA. And on top of that, the IAEA started censuring Iran for not cooperating with their inspections. There were issues with access to certain sites and information, and then there were reports that Iran was configuring centrifuges at their Fordo facility, which was supposed to be just a research site in a way that wasn't declared to the IAEA.
So a lot of red flags popping up. It sounds like things were spiraling pretty quickly.
Yeah, the situation was definitely deteriorating. The JCPOA was unraveling, trust was eroding, and the risk of miscalculation or escalation was growing.
Which brings us to now and these potential new talks. So what do we know about the current state of play? What are the prospects for diplomacy this time around?
Well, what we know for sure is that there have been meetings. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff met with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araki in Oman. Oman's been playing this mediator role for a while now, trying to bridge the gap between the U.S. and Iran.
Interesting. They're kind of like the Switzerland of the Middle East.
Right, trying to stay neutral and facilitate communication. And it's interesting, before meeting with the Iranians, Witkoff was actually in Russia, meeting with Putin to talk about the situation in Ukraine.
So Russia's in the mix too, which adds another layer of complexity.
Big time.
Yeah.
And speaking of complexity, there's this idea that's been floating around called the Trump to Tehran strategy. It's this counterintuitive notion that maybe the best way forward, despite all the bad blood and the maximum pressure campaign that Trump initiated, might be direct personal diplomacy between the top leaders of the U.S. and Iran.
Wow, that's a bold idea considering everything that's happened. But I guess sometimes you got to go outside the box to find a solution.
Right, it's thinking outside the traditional diplomatic channels. But there are some serious roadblocks, too. Iran has said that if sanctions are reimposed, they might just pull out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT.
And that would be a big deal, right? That's the treaty that basically governs the global effort to stop the spread of nuclear weapons.
Huge deal.
Yeah.
It would basically mean that Iran's nuclear program would have way less international oversight, less transparency, and that would make everyone even more nervous.
So higher stakes, more risk.
Definitely. And here's another sobering thought. There's an assessment out there that even if there was a large-scale military attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, it would only be a temporary setback.
So basically, bombing them wouldn't really solve the problem.
Not in the long run. They've got enriched material stockpiled, they've got centrifuges ready to go, and they've got the expertise. They could rebuild and reconstitute their program relatively quickly.
So not a clean or easy solution by any means.
Nope, far from it. And that brings us to the debate about military action, which has been raging for years.
Yeah, it's a really tough question and one that our sources definitely delve into. What are some of the arguments for and against using military force to try and stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon?
Well, on the one hand, you've got analysts like Matthew Kronig, who argue that the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran is so serious, so potentially destabilizing, that a carefully planned military strike might be the only way to prevent it. They worry that a nuclear Iran could spark a regional arms race, where other countries feel like they need nukes to protect themselves. And then there's the fear that Iran might share its nuclear technology with other countries, or even terrorist groups.
Scary stuff. So for some people, a military strike, as risky as it is seen as the lesser of two evils.
Exactly. They see it as a preventative measure, a way to avert a potentially catastrophic outcome down the line.
And what about the other side of the argument? What are the main concerns about using force?
Well, a lot of people, including experts, politicians, international organizations, they strongly oppose military action. They point to the huge risks involved. You could trigger a wider war in the region with unpredictable consequences. It could completely destabilize the Middle East, lead to massive civilian casualties, and potentially create even more fertile ground for extremism and terrorism.
So, unintended consequences, blowback. It's a classic dilemma with military intervention, right? It's never as clean and simple as it might seem at first.
Never. And there's a lot of historical baggage, too. Back in 2007, a group of senators, both Democrats and Republicans, sent a letter to President George W. Bush urging him not to attack Iran without congressional approval. They were basically saying that a unilateral military strike would be a huge mistake, both legally and strategically.
So the idea of attacking Iran has been controversial for a long time.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive issue, and there's never been a clear consensus in the U.S. about whether it's the right thing to do. And public opinion has fluctuated over time, with support for military action going up and down depending on the circumstances.
So no easy answers. It sounds like this is one of those issues where there are strong arguments on both sides and the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. It's a real conundrum. And it highlights the difficult choices that policymakers face when it comes to dealing with complex international challenges like Iran's nuclear program.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. It's been a fascinating, albeit somewhat sobering, deep dive into this whole issue. Before we wrap up, can you give us a quick recap of the key takeaways?
Sure. So we saw how there's this real split within Iran itself about how to engage with the U.S. on this whole nuclear thing. You've got conservatives who are deeply suspicious of the U.S., especially after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, and you've got reformists who see dialogue as the best, maybe only way forward. Then we delved into the history of the JCPOA itself, this complex agreement with all its nuances and limitations, and ultimately its failure to really resolve the underlying issues. And then there's the ongoing debate about what to do next. Should we try to revive diplomacy? Should we ratchet up the pressure on Iran? Or is military action, with all its risks, the only option left on the table?
Yeah, it's a lot to digest, but hopefully our listeners now have a much better understanding of just how complicated this whole situation is and why it's so difficult to find a solution that works for everyone. It's not just about Iran wanting a bomb or not. There's so much history, so much mistrust, so many different perspectives at play.
It's a geopolitical puzzle with a lot of moving pieces.
Exactly, and one that we'll all be watching closely in the coming months and years. So for our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. Considering everything we've discussed, what do you think is the most realistic path to actually achieving stability in the region and preventing the spread of nuclear weapons? Can diplomacy work, even after all that's happened? Is there a way to build trust? Or are we just destined for more confrontation and conflict? It's a question worth pondering as we move forward.